Welcome everyone. This is Conversations of the Fletcher Forum. We have with us today Dr. Michael Klein. He's a professor of international economics here at Fletcher. Dr. Klein, thank you very much for joining us.
Sure.
We really appreciate it.
Nice to be here, Andy.
Great. And Professor Klein's we're gonna talk a little bit about U.S. economic policy, kind of the state of the international economy, and just kind of talk about issues of the day. So I wanted to begin just talking about issues within the U.S. economy and the Treasury Department specifically. You served as a Chief Economist under Treasury Secretary Geithner, who stepped down just earlier this year. And I was wondering, in your estimation, what were some of the biggest accomplishments that the Treasury Department undertook under Secretary Geithner? And do you think that, how will history judge Secretary Geithner?
Well, I was Chief Economist for International Affairs, so that's a more narrow thing than the Chief Economist.
You weren't ruling over the Treasury Department?
I thought I was. I don't know. It didn't seem to work that way.
Okay.
So I think, clearly the biggest accomplishment of the Treasury and the Federal Reserve at the beginning of the Obama administration was keeping the economy from cratering. Mm-hmm. We really were at an abyss in the fall of 2008 and going into 2009. And so people, it's very hard to sort of argue against the counterfactual.
Sure.
And in the presidential campaign, we saw, people saying, well, the economy is in really bad shape. Mm-hmm. The counterfactual is the economy would have been in much worse shape. So that was really the signature achievement. However, that really wasn't in international affairs. Mm-hmm. In international affairs, there were some things linked to the performance of the U.S. economy directly. For example, the strength of the export sector as we came out of the Great Recession, or as we were coming out of the Great Recession, was really very helpful to the U.S. economy. And Obama talked about trying to double the level of exports, U.S. exports, which when I was there, it first struck me as kind of an unreasonable goal, but actually, when we were looking at the numbers, it seemed more attainable. Mm-hmm. But a lot of the other issues had to do with the U.S.-China relationship, what was going on in Europe, and also just more broadly, there were some broader things looking at other countries' examples as we moved forward. For example, the United Kingdom began a policy of austerity under David Cameron, beginning around the fall of 2010. Mm-hmm. And to many of us, that didn't seem like a good idea. And being able to have that comparative aspect of this is what's going on in Britain, this is what's going on in the United States. And you see that Britain and the United States sort of were coming out of the Great Recession in a very kind of parallel way until Britain put in place the austerity programs. The U.S. put in place programs that were stimulative, not as stimulative as maybe some people thought was appropriate, but still it was nothing like the British austerity. And you see this division at that point where Britain starts to go into a double-dip recession, mm-hmm. or even a triple-dip recession, whereas the United States, continued, albeit at a slow pace, to come out of it. So that was another aspect too, to look abroad and think about comparisons that would be useful for the United States.
Okay. And speaking about that, there's a very big sense, especially with the size, what the Treasury Department was able to do and how it was constrained by politics. And and discussion about the economy and the crisis here domestically. I was trying to get a sense of how much does domestic politics, how much does that impede some of the international work that you were trying to do?
There's a saying that domestic politics ends at the seashore, at mm-hmm. the nation's border.
Water's edge. At
the water's edge. Thank you. You're better trained in this than I am, clearly. To some extent, that's true. Mm-hmm. It was least true with respect to China.
Okay.
And there's this interesting feature that if Treasury declared China a currency manipulator, mm-hmm. then Congress could step in and impose sanctions.
Okay. So
that was, I think, the point where there was the most concern about or thoughtfulness about domestic politics. Mm-hmm. With Europe, for domestic politics, there was an understanding that this was a potential tinderbox for the U.S. economy. But it wasn't seen, in the same way where domestic political considerations played as big a role. while I was at Treasury, we didn't have an issue like the Mexican debt crisis in 94, 95, where the money made available to Mexico was made available through the Treasury's Exchange Stabilization Fund in a way to sidestep Congress. So nothing like that arose.
Okay.
The biggest sort of domestic political issue, I think, really had to do with the U.S.-China relationship. And what was interesting at Treasury was that we had not only economists working there, but also political scientists or people who were very, very knowledgeable about the structure of the Chinese government. A number of Fletcher people, in fact. And that was really interesting to me, coming as a pure economist and seeing the interplay of political science and understanding of the political structure and how that affected economic decisions, and also how economic decisions could affect politics within China, where there are different groups. The People's Bank of China, who was broadly more in favor of strengthening the renminbi to help slow inflation, and other parts of the government that were interested in keeping the renminbi relatively weak to help support the export sector.
Okay, and in the campaign, I remember quite one of the kind of differences, at least in rhetoric, was Mitt Romney brought this up quite a bit, the idea that China was manipulating its currency. And I was wondering, again, this is a little bit of a counterfactual, but if do you think a lot of that was rhetoric, or do you think if there was a Republican administration that there would be a difference in policy, or was that just kind of a political campaign trying to make a difference?
Well, we'll never know.
Okay. Sure.
And what people say in the campaign is often quite distinct from what they do once they're governing. Certainly China manipulates its currency, and the extent to which they manipulate their currency is somewhat open to question. But any country with a fixed exchange rate manipulates its currency.
Sure.
So are they keeping their currency deeply undervalued? I think that's less true now. And part of I had an interesting discussion at Treasury with the people who were the economic correspondents. They have a little room in the basement of Treasury, and they're not allowed out of it, and we're not allowed to go in.
There's no daylight.
No daylight at all. No. It's a pretty desperate place.
Okay.
And we can, as Treasury staff, we can only go in with somebody from the External Affairs or Public Relations staff. So I went in, and I talked to them about the real exchange rate versus a nominal exchange rate, which you know well because you took my course and did well in it. And the idea that if China has higher inflation, even with a fixed exchange rate, their goods are going to become more expensive than the United States. So this is something that really was kind of overlooked. And the Treasury Secretary started to play this up, and it started to get picked up in the newspaper. And I think that's appropriate because the extent of the undervaluation of the renminbi really has to take into account these inflation differentials. And when you do take that into account, well, we don't really know what inflation is in China, but we know that it's higher than the United States. We also know that it's probably higher in the coastal areas, which are the export areas, than it is in the interior. So when you start to look at those things, then the undervaluation isn't as pronounced as you would think by just looking at the minute amounts that the renminbi changes week to week or month to month.
Okay.
So that's an important consideration too, in a way in which economic analysis sort of informs politics, or should inform politics, to think about that. Of course, people wanted a cudgel to to fight China, and the value of the renminbi offered one. But there's a way in which that analysis has to take into account other factors as well.